They called it the War Between Brothers, but it was more than that. It was a nightmare written in blood. The American Civil War remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Between 1861 and 1865, the land of liberty became a graveyard of its own ideals. More than 600,000 lives were lost. Fathers, sons, farmers, preachers, and boys who had never even seen the world beyond their hometowns. It was a war so brutal that entire towns vanished. Fields became oceans of blood. Bodies lay for days under the burning sun, and rivers ran red after every battle. Disease spread faster than bullets. Smallpox, dysentery, and infection claimed more soldiers than gunfire ever could. At Antietam, the fighting was so fierce that men said the air itself screamed. At Gettysburg, bullets filled the sky like rain. And in the prison camps of Andersonville, tens of thousands of captured soldiers starved in open pits, their bodies reduced to bone and skin, a vision of pure despair. This wasn't a war fought on distant shores. It was fought in America's backyards. Churches became hospitals. Schools became barracks. Families were torn apart, brother against brother, father against son. And when it was over, nothing was the same. Cities burned, hearts broke, and a nation that once called itself united was left bleeding from the inside. Before we dive deeper into this powerful chapter of history, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you love real stories that uncover the truth behind the past, make sure to subscribe, because what comes next will show how this war began and how it forever changed America. Long before the first shot was fired, America was already divided, not by oceans or borders, but by belief. In the North, cities grew fast, factories roared, railroads stretched across miles of new land, and money flowed through industry. The North believed in progress, in free labor, and in a future without slavery. But in the South, life was built on cotton and on the backs of enslaved people who worked the fields under brutal conditions. Slavery wasn't just an institution there. It was the foundation of their economy and power. For decades, arguments filled Congress halls. Each new state added to the Union became a battleground. Would it allow slavery or ban it? Compromises were made, broken, and made again. But nothing could stop what was coming. In 1860, one man's election lit the final fuse. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, was chosen as the 16th President of the United States. He promised to stop the spread of slavery. To the South, that meant war. Within weeks, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the Union. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The Union was breaking apart. The very idea of the United States, one nation, indivisible, was dying before the world's eyes. Then came the moment that turned tension into fire. April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate guns opened fire on a small federal fort called Fort Sumter. Shell after shell rained down for 34 hours. Smoke covered the sky. The fort eventually surrendered. That single cannon shot echoed across the entire nation. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. Crowds cheered in the streets. Young men rushed to enlist. Flags waved proudly. Many thought the war would be over in weeks. They had no idea of the storm they were walking into. Because soon, those same fields where children once played would be filled with fire, blood, and endless sorrow. The first major battle came only months later, July 21, 1861. Near a quiet stream in Virginia called Bull Run, two great armies faced each other for the first time. Thousands of spectators from Washington came to watch, dressed in fine clothes, bringing baskets of food. They thought it would be a brief show of Northern power, a quick defeat of the rebellious South. But what they witnessed that day was chaos. The Union Army charged, confident and loud, but the Confederates stood their ground. The fighting turned brutal. Smoke and screams filled the air as cannons thundered across the hills. And then, in the middle of the slaughter, a Confederate general stood tall on his horse, refusing to retreat. His men pointed to him and shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." From that day on, he was known as Stonewall Jackson, one of the South's most legendary commanders. By sunset, the Union Army broke and fled, abandoning the field in panic. Wagons, horses, and men rushed back toward Washington. What began as excitement ended in terror. The truth was clear. This war would not be quick. It would not be easy. It would tear everything apart. In the months that followed, both sides dug in. Training camps filled the countryside, new weapons were built, and young boys learned to march and kill. The North believed they were fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the United States together. The South believed they were fighting for their rights, their homes, and their way of life. But beneath those reasons lay something darker, the question of slavery. 4 million enslaved men, women, and children waited in silence, knowing that the outcome of this war would decide their fate. As winter came, the nation froze in fear. Every town waited for letters from the front lines. Every family prayed that their sons would return. But in 1862, the war would reach a level of destruction that no one could have imagined. New generals would rise, entire cities would burn, and the fields of America would drown in blood. By early 1862, the war had consumed the nation. The blue and the gray marched across the same soil, leaving nothing behind but ashes. The Union sought to choke the South by controlling its rivers and cutting off supply lines. The first great victories came under a rising general, Ulysses S. Grant. In the frozen winter of Tennessee, he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, forcing thousands of Confederate soldiers to surrender. When asked for terms, Grant gave a reply that would echo through history: no terms except unconditional surrender. The North cheered. The newspapers called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. But victory came at a terrible cost. Only weeks later, the two armies met again at a small church in Tennessee called Shiloh. The battle lasted 2 days. When it was over, more than 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Bodies lay in heaps. Blood pooled in the muddy fields. The smell of death hung in the spring air for weeks. For the first time, both sides realized this was not a brief rebellion. It was a war of annihilation. Further east, in Virginia, the Union Army launched a massive invasion toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. Leading them was General George McClellan, a cautious, proud man who built one of the largest armies ever seen in America. But waiting for him was the Confederate genius Robert E. Lee. Calm, brilliant, and deeply loyal to his home state of Virginia, Lee led the South with courage and precision. At the 7 days' battles, Lee drove McClellan back, saving Richmond and shocking the North. McClellan retreated, the Union's hope dimmed. The war dragged on, and death became a daily headline. As the fighting raged, enslaved people across the South began escaping to Union lines. Some risked everything, walking for miles at night, hiding by day, guided only by the North Star. They called themselves contrabands of war. And though they were not yet free by law, they knew something had begun to change. Then came September 17, 1862, the day that turned the earth red. The Battle of Antietam, fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, became the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 23,000 casualties in just one day.
Men fell in line so thick that the fields looked like waves of blue and gray. At a sunken road, later known as Bloody Roan, thousands died within a few hundred yards. The cornfield nearby was cut down not by harvesters, but by bullets. The Union held the field, but it was no triumph. The dead were everywhere. The stench of war hung over the land for weeks. Yet from this horror, President Abraham Lincoln saw an opportunity. He had waited for a victory to announce something that would change the war and the world forever. Soon, the fight would no longer be just for the Union. It would be for freedom itself.
The morning of January 1st, 1863, began in silence. The country was weary. The war had raged for nearly 2 years. Cities were mourning. Families were starving. Hope was fading. Then, in the White House, Abraham Lincoln signed a single piece of paper that would change the purpose of the war and the very soul of the nation. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. With a steady hand, Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were now and forever free. The word spread like wildfire through the South, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by Union soldiers, and prayed over by those who had waited generations for that moment. Not everyone was free that day. The order didn't reach every corner at once, but it marked a turning point. The war was no longer just about restoring the Union. It was now a fight for human freedom. While the battles in the East captured the world's attention, the war in the Western theater was just as fierce, and often even bloodier. General Ulysses S. Grant led the Union Army in a bold campaign to control the Mississippi River, the lifeline of the Confederacy. His target? Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city perched high on cliffs overlooking the river. For 47 days, Grant's army besieged the city. Civilians hid in caves as shells tore through homes. Food ran out. Water was scarce. The streets were littered with the dead and dying. By the time the city surrendered on July 4, 1863, over 30,000 Confederate soldiers were captured, and the Mississippi River was under Union control. This victory split the Confederacy in two and gave the Union a strategic advantage that would prove decisive in the coming years. Meanwhile, in the East, Robert E. Lee refused to surrender. He rebuilt his forces and continued to challenge Union armies, proving again and again why he was feared and respected. But the Union Army was growing stronger, better equipped, and more determined. The war was no longer about quick victories. It had become a test of endurance. Each side suffered, each side killed, and each side grieved. The human cost of these campaigns was staggering. Disease claimed more men than bullets. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia spread through the camps like wildfire. Soldiers wrote letters home pleading for mercy, for an end, for a glimpse of hope. Families received news of deaths in cryptic telegrams, sometimes days or weeks after the fact. And yet amidst the horrors, courage and heroism shone through. From the young drummer boys who delivered orders across battlefield chaos to medics who risked their lives to save strangers, countless acts of bravery were recorded. Small beacons of humanity in a war defined by suffering. By the end of 1863, the tide had begun to turn. The Union had victories in the West. Gettysburg had halted Lee's invasion of the North. The path to victory was no longer impossible, but the road ahead would demand more blood, more sacrifice, and more courage than any American could imagine. The war was far from over. Cities would burn, armies would clash, and the very heart of America would be tested to its limits. By 1864, the Union had found new leaders who would change the course of the war. Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Unlike his predecessors, he believed in relentless pressure, a war of attrition that the South could not sustain. Grant's strategy was simple but brutal. Engage Lee's army continuously, force them into battle, and make the Confederacy bleed until it could fight no longer. He understood the cost. Thousands would die. Entire towns would suffer. But he also knew it was the only way to end the war. In the East, Grant clashed repeatedly with Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Battles like Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor became endless, bloody stalemates. Cannons tore through forests. Bullets cut swaths through ranks. Men fell by the hundreds, yet neither side yielded. Meanwhile, in the South, a new campaign brought fire to the heart of Georgia. General William Tecumseh Sherman led his famous March to the Sea in 1864. Starting in Atlanta, Sherman's army cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across the state. Railroads were torn up. Crops and livestock were burned. Homes were destroyed. The idea was terrifying. Total war. Civilian and soldier alike would feel the consequences. Soldiers wrote home about the smoke rising from burning towns, the screams of terrified families, and the silence that followed. For the first time, war was not just fought on battlefields, it consumed the land itself. But the Union's strategy was working. By late 1864, Atlanta fell, boosting Northern morale and securing Lincoln's re-election. The South's resources were dwindling. Their armies were exhausted. The end, though still distant, was approaching. But even in this final phase, tragedy remained constant. Andersonville, the infamous prison camp in Georgia, continued to claim lives. Hunger, disease, and neglect killed nearly 13,000 Union prisoners held there. The horrors of war extended far beyond the battlefields. Families, towns, and innocents suffered in equal measure. The stage was set for the final campaign, the surrender that would end the Civil War, reunite a fractured nation, and reveal the full cost of America's bloodiest conflict. Just as the nation began to breathe a cautious sigh of relief, tragedy struck in the darkest hour. On the evening of April 14, 1865, barely a week after Robert E. Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The theater was filled with laughter and applause, a city trying to reclaim normalcy after 4 years of unimaginable war. But in the shadows lurked a man named John Wilkes Booth, a fervent supporter of the Confederacy. With a single shot fired from behind Lincoln's head, the life of the man who had steered the nation through its darkest days was taken. Lincoln died the following morning, plunging the country into grief and uncertainty. Across the nation, the news spread like wildfire. Mourning filled every city and town. Flags were flown at half-mast. Bells tolled in sorrow. People wept openly in the streets, clutching newspapers with trembling hands. Booth's assassination was more than a personal tragedy. It was a national shock, a reminder that even in victory, the wounds of war remained raw. The man who had preserved the Union and given hope to millions of enslaved people was gone, leaving a fragile country without its guiding hand. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency amid chaos. He faced the enormous task of leading a nation still reeling from war, loss, and hatred. The battles had ended, but the struggle for the soul of the country was just beginning. Families grieved for soldiers who would never return home. Enslaved people mourned the long shadow of slavery, even as they celebrated newfound freedom. And a nation that had been ripped apart at its seams now faced the daunting challenge of reconstruction, rebuilding not only cities and towns, but trust, law, and a shared identity. The Civil War had ended, but its echoes would shape every corner of America for generations to come. With the guns silenced and the Confederate armies defeated, the United States faced a new kind of battle, rebuilding a nation torn apart. The South lay in ruins. Railroads were destroyed, bridges collapsed, and cities were charred remnants of what they once were. Plantations, once symbols of wealth and power, were abandoned or burned. Farmers struggled to grow crops on land that had been ravaged by years of conflict. But the greatest challenge was not physical. It was social and political. 4 million formerly enslaved people were now free, but freedom alone did not guarantee equality, safety, or opportunity. Many had no land, no money, and no education. They faced hostility from former slaveholders, violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and laws designed to restrict their rights. To address these challenges, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. It provided food, clothing, medical care, and education. Schools were built, teachers arrived from the North, and literacy spread through African American communities like wildfire. Politically, the nation faced intense divisions. Southern states were required to swear loyalty to the Union, rewrite their constitutions, and ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Yet resistance was fierce. Many white Southerners sought to maintain their old power, enacting black codes to control the lives of freed people. In the North, debates raged over how harshly the South should be punished and how fully freed people should be integrated into society. Some wanted leniency, believing reconciliation would preserve the Union. Others demanded justice and protection for African Americans. Amid these struggles, African Americans began to claim political power. They were elected to local and national offices. For the first time in history, formerly enslaved men voted and participated in government, shaping laws and policies in ways that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Yet, for every step forward, there were setbacks. Violence, intimidation, and systemic oppression threatened to undo progress. The promise of freedom was real, but it was fragile, dependent on law, vigilance, and the courage of those willing to fight for it. Reconstruction was a time of hope and fear, triumph and tragedy. It was the first test of whether the United States could truly live up to its founding ideals after the crucible of the Civil War.
In 1865, the Confederacy was crumbling. Food was scarce, cities were in ruins, and the Southern armies were exhausted. General Ulysses S. Grant pressed forward relentlessly. In the spring, he launched a decisive campaign against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, moving steadily toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. The fighting was unrelenting. At Petersburg, Union troops laid siege to the city for 9 months, cutting off supplies and starving the defenders. Civilians hid in cellars as artillery shells tore through streets. The countryside was destroyed, and the once prosperous land was reduced to rubble. Finally, on April 2, 1865, Union forces broke through. Richmond fell. The Confederate government fled, leaving behind a city smoldering in ashes. Just a week later, on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war that had begun with a single cannon shot at Fort Sumter was finally over. Lee's surrender was dignified. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses and personal possessions, and no one would be prosecuted for treason. The victory was monumental, but the cost was staggering. Over 600,000 men had died. Millions had been displaced. Cities and plantations lay in ruins, and the psychological scars would haunt the nation for generations. The Emancipation Proclamation, now fully realized, had freed millions of enslaved people. Yet freedom came with challenges. Rebuilding lives, communities, and a shattered nation would be the work of decades. The aftermath. America emerged from the Civil War forever changed. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. But the country faced the daunting task of reconstruction, a time of rebuilding, reconciliation, and reckoning with the sins of the past. For the soldiers who survived, the battlefields remained etched in memory. For the families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers, the grief was endless. And for the nation itself, the war became a solemn reminder. Liberty is precious, but fragile. It is won and protected at an unimaginable cost. The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies. It was a struggle over identity, morality, and the soul of a nation. It tore communities apart, reshaped the laws, and forced Americans to confront the realities of freedom, equality, and justice. The smoke of cannons has long since cleared. The blood has long since soaked into the earth. But the lessons remain. A nation divided can rise only when it acknowledges its past and commits to a future of unity. The story of the American Civil War is not just about war. It is about human courage, sacrifice, and the fight for freedom. It is a story that must never be forgotten. Even after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, not all Confederate forces had laid down their arms. Far to the south, in North Carolina, Alabama, and the Mississippi Valley, scattered armies continued to fight, unaware or unwilling to accept the war's end. General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the Confederate forces in the Carolinas, attempted one last desperate stand against Sherman's advancing Union army. Sherman, relentless after his march to the sea, moved northward, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. Cities were burned, railways destroyed, and supply lines cut. The once prosperous plantations were reduced to rubble. At Bentonville, in March 1865, Union and Confederate forces clashed in one of the final major battles of the war. The fighting was brutal. Artillery tore through the woods, muskets cracked in unending volleys, and men fell in staggering numbers. The Confederate soldiers fought with courage, even as their chances of victory dwindled. Hunger and exhaustion plagued them. Morale faltered, but the fight persisted, a testament to their determination and desperation. Meanwhile, in Alabama, General Richard Taylor tried to hold the Mississippi River region. Union troops advanced steadily, capturing cities and cutting off supplies. Confederate forces, outnumbered and underfed, were forced to retreat repeatedly. Every skirmish, every stand was a reminder that the war had become a struggle for survival, not just for armies, but for entire communities. Civilians in the South hid in cellars and barns, praying that the fighting would pass, that their homes would survive, that their families would endure. By late April 1865, it was clear the Confederacy could no longer sustain itself. Johnston finally surrendered to Sherman at Bennett Place on April 26th, effectively ending the remaining organized resistance. With Johnston's surrender, the Civil War officially came to a close. For the first time in 4 long, bloody years, Americans could hope for peace. The victory for the Union was decisive. The Confederate armies had been defeated. The Southern states were occupied, and the promise of emancipation and a reunited nation hung in the air like a fragile, hard-won breath. Yet, the cost of victory was profound. Cities in ruins, millions of lives lost, and the monumental task of rebuilding a fractured country awaiting them. The stage was now set for the aftermath, a period that would challenge the nation in new ways, testing not only the power of government, but the very hearts and minds of its people.
The end of the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction brought profound changes to the United States, not just socially, but legally and politically. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery entirely. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave African American men the right to vote, a revolutionary change in American democracy. These amendments represented the nation's attempt to fulfill the promise of freedom, but the work of implementing them was fraught with difficulty. Southern states faced federal oversight. Military districts were created to enforce the new laws and protect the rights of freed people. Some Southern leaders resisted openly, refusing to allow African Americans to hold office or vote freely.
Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to undermine Reconstruction efforts, targeting both African Americans and Northern officials trying to enforce justice. In the North, the political landscape was also turbulent. President Andrew Johnson clashed repeatedly with Congress over how lenient or strict Reconstruction should be. Johnson, a Southerner who remained loyal to the Union, favored rapid reintegration of the Southern states with minimal protections for freed people. Congress, led by the radical Republicans, demanded stricter measures to ensure equality and to punish former Confederates. These political battles defined the era. Laws were passed, vetoes were overridden, and tensions between the executive and legislative branches threatened to destabilize the fragile post-war peace. Amid the political chaos, ordinary Americans tried to rebuild their lives. Freed people formed communities, built schools and churches, and began to own land. Former soldiers returned home struggling to find work or cope with the trauma of war. Southern society was transformed, but old resentments and divisions remained deeply rooted. The amendments were monumental victories. On paper, however, progress was slow and hard-won. The promise of Reconstruction was real, but it was under constant attack. The nation had survived civil war. Now it faced the even more difficult task of healing, rebuilding, and defining what true freedom meant in a land scarred by 4 years of unimaginable violence. With the guns silenced and the Confederacy defeated, soldiers returned home to landscapes forever altered. Some came back to welcoming families and rebuilt towns, but many returned to devastation. Their homes had been destroyed, crops burned, and communities fractured by years of relentless war. Union veterans in the North found cities changed by the industrial boom that had powered the war effort. Factories had expanded, railroads stretched farther than ever before, and new opportunities emerged. But the memories of friends lost and battles fought haunted them. Letters never sent, comrades buried in foreign fields, and the constant weight of trauma lingered in quiet moments. In the South, the returning Confederate soldiers faced harsher realities. Their cities lay in ruin, families were impoverished, many had no work and little food. The plantations they once tended were either abandoned, destroyed, or now worked by freed people who were asserting their newfound independence. The social order that once had defined their lives was gone. For the millions of freed people, life was both hopeful and perilous. They established schools, often in churches or simple shacks, where children and adults learned to read and write for the first time. Churches became centers of community, politics, and resistance. African Americans organized to claim their rights, vote, and hold office, sometimes even in the very towns that had once enslaved them. Yet every step forward faced violent pushback. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations terrorized freed people and their allies, burning homes, attacking schools, and lynching those who dared to challenge the old order. Laws known as Black Codes sought to limit economic freedom, enforce segregation, and suppress political participation. Despite the danger, the determination to survive and thrive was remarkable. Formerly enslaved families moved westward or settled in towns, buying land when possible, creating businesses and forming communities that would endure for generations. The spirit of resilience defined this era, the first steps toward a new social reality in the United States. Daily life during Reconstruction was a balance between hope and hardship. Families rebuilt homes with limited materials. Women worked both in households and in emerging industries to support their families.
Children went to school while still helping on farms or in small trades. The war's scars were everywhere, in the physical destruction, in the lingering grief, and in the tension between old ways and new ways of life. The nation was slowly learning that winning a war did not automatically create peace or equality. The Civil War had ended the fighting, but it had also opened a new, long struggle, one for justice, equality, and true national unity.
The Civil War ended over 150 years ago, yet its echoes continue to shape America. It was a conflict that redefined the nation, politically, socially, and morally. The Union was preserved, but at a staggering cost. Over 600,000 lives were lost, leaving families and communities shattered. Towns and cities lay in ruins, and the countryside bore scars of cannon fire, burned homes, and abandoned battlefields. The abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment was a monumental victory. It legally ended centuries of bondage and opened the door for African Americans to claim their rights. The 14th and 15th Amendments laid the foundation for citizenship, equal protection under the law, and voting rights, principles that would guide the nation toward a more just society, even as resistance persisted. Reconstruction brought progress and setbacks. African Americans gained education, political power, and economic opportunity, yet faced intense violence and systemic oppression. The rise of Jim Crow laws in the South would undermine many of these gains, showing that freedom required more than legislation. It required vigilance, courage, and persistence. The Civil War was also left a lasting imprint on American memory and identity. Monuments were erected, histories written, and stories passed down, some accurate, others romanticized. The war became a lens through which Americans have grappled with issues of race, liberty, and national unity ever since. The courage and sacrifice of soldiers, medics, civilians, and leaders from both sides remain a testament to the human cost of conflict. It showed the devastating consequences of division and hatred, and the profound strength required to rebuild a nation from its ashes. Today, the battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh, the letters of soldiers, and the speeches of leaders like Abraham Lincoln serve as reminders. They remind us of the fragility of democracy, the price of freedom, and the enduring need for justice. The Civil War was more than a fight between North and South. It was a struggle over the nation's soul, a defining moment that reshaped America forever. The story of the Civil War is a story of tragedy, courage, and transformation. It is a story of how a nation, torn apart by hatred and division, found a path toward unity.